Now I move on to Chartres, and this is a church built over an extended period of time. The facade is built between 1145 and 1155. There's a great fire in 1194 when only the lower part of the western facade will survive. The nave and choir are built between 1194 and 1220. The rest of the sculpture is built around 1235. And in this case, you can look at the cathedral and see something quite impressive. The choir is almost a third of the building. So the area back here is almost a third of the building. It's a massive, massive choir. And this is related to the ideas of sacred geometry as well as the ideas of scholasticism, this intellectual movement that we see developing in France at the time, where they're looking at sacred geometry and looking at ways to make the cathedrals, amongst other things, more symbolic. So we have this massive structure. We have a mature, more or less high Gothic style. And this would have been a major pilgrimage destination at the time for the Veil of the Virgin. It also, as you can see, dominates the landscape. There's a church that can be seen easily 20 miles away. And when we look at the floor plan, you also get a sense of just the sheer size of that choir. It's much, much wider than the nave. In terms of floor space, it's virtually the same floor space as the nave. So it's a massive, massive structure. Now, we're going to start by dealing with a few of the issues in this cathedral a little bit deeper. And where we're starting is the royal portal. This will have been the entrance reserved for the king and queen. It's deeper and more elaborate, and it looks very much like a stone screen, where we have all these figures, and it almost becomes so busy that you can't actually pick out individual figures. And we see 22 figures in the jab. In other words, these vertical figures next to the doors. And they visually unite the three different entrances. The Old Testament figures here are in the jabs, in these vertical positions next to the doors, and then New Testament figures are above. This is a visual representation of the basic theology of the church, that the Old Testament lays the foundation for the New. The Old Testament figures are queens, kings, patriarchs, and prophets, ancestors to Jesus, and the columns, again, metaphorically support the church. In terms of the images in the tympanum, in those arches above the doors, we see the Virgin and Child at the right. We see Christ's ascension at the left, and we see the second coming in the center. Now, as we look closer at these jab figures, these statues are built over a period of nearly 100 years. They're not all done at once, so we see massive shifts taking place. The older ones we see on the left. The figures are very much attached to the columns. They're very much stretched out so that they become part of that column. They're stiff, they're frontal, they're elongated, and they're very similar to what we would expect in the Romanesque. We can even see the modeling here with the continuous repetition of line, which doesn't look very realistic. Then we go over to the right, and these are newer. You can even see from the dates, they're about 75, 80 years newer. And these are less similar. You look at these figures, and they're each individual. St. Martin, Jerome, and Gregory, as opposed to our other figures, our older figures. We're seeing a movement towards Gothic interest in naturalism. They're at least looking at a human being. I don't want to say they're using a model as such, but they're definitely looking at humans. And we see them wearing contemporary liturgical clothing, exactly what priests would be wearing at the time when the cathedral is built. And this all would have been painted, an issue we'll deal with shortly. Now, if we look at another of these statues, this is St. Theodore. St. Alvin and Simon are elsewhere. Don't write that part down. If we compare that to the older Old Testament prophet that we see on the left, we see again that vast difference. St. Theodore looks almost human, like he could walk off of that pillar that he's standing on. Whereas if St. Jerome or Isaiah were to step off of this stone column, we'd be in fear for our lives. So we see this incredible contrast. St. Theodore is portraying an ideal Christian knight, and he's dressed just like they would have at the time, just like someone in the Crusades. You'll notice there's no plate armor, very, very uncommon. And he's much more lifelike. We see him naturalistic and proportionate. He also has a bit of an S-curve to him. You'll see the shoulders kind of go one way, the hips go that way, so we have this sort of very faint curve running through. They're starting to bring back ideas to make the statues look more lifelike and more interesting, ideas that the Greeks had had. He's also much more approachable for the viewer. He looks human, which means we can kind of place ourselves in that position. He becomes relatable. Now, he's departing from the abstraction of the Romanesque, and he's arguably much closer to the Renaissance than to the Romanesque. The reason is the Renaissance, we always say it starts in Italy, etc., but many could argue that the Renaissance starts in France earlier, just based on the sculpture that they're going to be creating, and we'll see more of this. Now, the interior of the cathedral is massive. It's 122 feet tall, so roughly 12 stories. It's briefly the tallest structure in Europe. And the space is much more balanced and unified. We have a 3-part elevation with our clerestory, our gallery, and our aisle, and it all seems to fit together really well. We have a 4-part vault, which is going to be preferred by the Gothic. Because they've played with the 6-part, it's not that much of an improvement in terms of structure. So we go back to this 4-part elevation. We see this elaborate choir at the east end. And we see flying buttresses, which will be planned from the beginning. This is another structure where we're not sure if Notre Dame or Chartres will use the flying buttress first. And there's a lot of stained glass. One of the most famous... Before we get to that, these are elevations of Notre Dame, Chartres, and Amiens, which we haven't gotten to yet. And you see that evolution taking place. The small clerestory at Notre Dame, where they had a triform, but becomes these windows beneath. So we really have sort of dual windows, gets opened up at Chartres and opened up even more at Amiens. We also see that gallery is moving higher and higher, and the aisle is becoming more and more vertical as we continue. So we're kind of halfway to Amiens. But this is the stained glass window. This is the Virgin and Child, and this is one of 3 windows from 1170 that will survive the fire of 1194. In the center, we see the Virgin enthroned with Jesus. The angels surrounding are added in the 13th century. These windows are changed regularly. We see an image that's frontal but young and beautifully rendered. And this is a good chance to point out this is stained glass. So you notice they've painted on the glass to give it the details of the face, as well as the hands and feet. That is stained glass. What we usually see in the United States is called leaded glass, and that's where I take small pieces of colored glass and put them together. By the way, there's a reason for this. I may have covered it already, but those small pieces of colored glass are much more pragmatic than you would think. They're cheaper and easier to produce than a giant pane of clear glass. So they use this form using leaded and stained glass to create these windows because you just couldn't afford to, even if you could manufacture a giant pane of glass this size, you probably couldn't afford to put it in your cathedral. So it becomes a pragmatic issue, and then they discover you can create stories with this, and it becomes a teaching tool, a didactic tool, which makes it that much more interesting. Now we also have the rose window and lancets. And in this case, this is paid for by the Queen of France, by the name of Blanche of Castile around 1220. And here we see a couple of interesting things. We see this gold castle on the red background beneath the actual rose window. We see one here and here, here and here again. And those are symbols of the royal family. These windows, where it's a gold, what's called a fleur-de-lis on a blue background, that's a symbol of France itself. And then when we look at, we see the Virgin and Child, and then we see other images. And these are all images of motherhood. The whole theme is motherhood, pushing this idea of people having children. And you sit there and you go, why? Why is the theme motherhood? Well, the theme is motherhood not because she's the queen of the country and therefore the mother to everyone, but rather because what she's doing and what France wants is more children. Because if you have more children, you can have a bigger army. If you have a bigger army, you can compete with anyone. Numbers are everything here. It's not an idea that goes away. In fact, into the 20th century, in the Soviet Union, if you had more than 5 children, you got a war medal. And that's probably appropriate in some ways. In Germany, same thing. Every country, even into the modern day, wants a certain population because they want an army. And you can't have an army if you don't have enough people. So that's why motherhood frequently becomes a major theme. It's also tied to the fact that the Virgin Mary, of course, is particularly important at this time. So there's that as well. But I'm just giving you sort of the political side rather than the religious side of it here.